LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Let me tell you a story. It goes like this. Just think in your mind's eye about the 14-year-old David Cameron. Picture the scene. Today is a school day. The sun shining in. In his private school, George Osborne would hit people hard because he hates the poor, the weak and the vulnerable. Meanwhile,
I went to my local comprehensive to stroke the dinner ladies, and even I find it depressing.
Imagine if that was you. Ed Miliband has the face of an ostrich.
This face is not something I chose. Wallace from Wallace and Gromit.
That is my face. But don't let that put you off, just for a minute. I want to tell you my story. 14-year-old. David Cameron's not going to school. He drank 2 whole bottles of brandy. 1967 brandy. And then what did he do? I would score a line from drug dealers, play computer games all day, and beat off in my childhood bedroom. Next.
The knock at the door.
I was standing on the doorstep. What do you find? David Cameron lurking in the shadows, his package exposed, with a £1 coin stuck to it. And Nick Clegg said, "My God, it's much worse than I thought." But, yes, I knew it would be hard. If you can make it big, all credit to you. In British politics today, the size of our members is really massive. Unless, of course, you're called Ed Miliband or you're a member of the Labour Party. Don't believe him. It goes much, much wider and bigger than that. I know that you can't see it or feel it right now.
That's Nick Clegg's job.
I felt it. And that takes a certain kind of character. It's an experience I will never forget. Nick Clegg and I rubbing along together, flat out, which is a pretty remarkable sight. Come on. Let's pull together. Let's come together. No, I think is the answer. In the end, David Cameron came first and loudest. I really am very, very sorry, but I have the heaviest balls, and let me tell you, I was so long in coming, it was uncomfortable. David Cameron made a rotten mess. I'll just leave it for the council to clear it up. LOL. Well, I feel much better for that, and I hope it was therapeutic for you as well.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Andy Duncan, who joins us to discuss the 2015 UK general election and the wider political scene, past, present and future. Like many political systems around the world, UK politics is deeply divided and in a growing state of disarray. Many feel that voting in the UK today has become all but irrelevant, and in future may achieve little more than cementing a series of incoherent, toothless and conflict-ridden coalitions. In the face of enormous challenges, we get little from the political class beyond predictable, undeliverable policy promises and outright bribes for special interest groups during arguably the most unpredictable UK election of the modern age. And yet many citizens still believe that their vote actually counts for something, when in the vast majority of cases it rarely, if ever, makes any difference to anything. In this programme we explore these and other related issues, including why the differences between the main political parties are disappearing, where we are headed if things continue as they are, and how the global financial crisis of 2007, which was not allowed to run its course, will come back to bite us. Other questions include: has political correctness made early 21st century politics a pointless exercise? What does the rise of smaller parties from across the political spectrum and the emergence of regional secessionist movements mean going forward? And in a system where voters can see no real alternatives and increasingly resign themselves to disillusion and apathy, what will UK and indeed global democracy look like in the coming decades? Hello and welcome, Andy, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalisedfreedom.com.
Nice to be here again.
Now, Andy, today we're going to be tackling the delights of the forthcoming UK general election. Just to people listening to this in the future, this is 2015 we're talking about. That's coming up as we speak in about 10 days' time, a little bit less actually. Before we dive into that, just give folks your potted bio a little bit about what you do and other things you do on the side.
Well, I work in the financial training industry, where I'm mainly a lecturer in financial techniques, but I've also done lots of various things in the past and various podcasts for Gold Money and for Casey Research. And I'm looking at building an Austrian-based website in the UK. And I do a little bit of work for the Mises Institute in Alabama occasionally on a kind of personal level. And I've written a novel. It's called Sword of Marathon. And it's about the foundation of democracy in Athens, but it's kind of a story. It's not quite Games of Thrones, but it was a lot of fun to write. And I'm building some websites at the moment. I've read this really brilliant book called Rework, which is about redefining your life via the internet and internet technologies. And so I'm looking at doing that kind of thing.
Oh, well, that sounds very interesting. I look forward to finding out more about that. Okay, the UK election... We should just say to listeners up front, they probably guess if they visited my website before, that we're not going to be championing any of these parties or saying anything particularly complimentary about any of it. My first observation, which actually got me started in contacting you again to get you back on, was that we're sitting here for various structural reasons in the political scene, one of the most unpredictable elections in modern times, if not the most unpredictable. And yet the political response to this has been more than predictable behaviour, and this is despite the atomization of the UK political scene and the rise of all the main parties of support has dropped off. We've got the rise of smaller parties, but for so many of them, it's like they've got no other response than just to go through the motions again when the situation facing them requires a really imaginative, different response. But they're not up to that.
Well, I feel a bit like the man in the shed in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because this is the first election, actually, where I've paid absolutely no attention whatsoever to anything. Occasionally things kind of break through my curtain, and I do occasionally see the odd thing, the end of Newsnight or the end of a news program when I'm watching Match of the Day or something. But I've tried to just completely avoid this election, and I feel much, much better for it. People who I meet occasionally say, "Oh, what do you think of this thing that's just come up in the election?" And I'll say, "I have no idea. I'm not following it at all."
Well, I do follow the process because it overlaps with other things that I'm very interested in. Economics. I know you might say, well, you don't need to follow the domestic political process to have an interest, but I do it for practical reasons. Economics, energy, the environment, all of great interest to me, and I want to know what these people are up to, basically. But it says something, it really does, that in 2015, that you, who's practically the man in the shed in Hitchhiker's Guide, that you are uniquely qualified to be discussing this.
Well, one of my great heroes, Murray Rothbard, although he realised the state is just a band of robbers writ large, just a gang of thieves, a kind of superannuated mafia, unorganised criminal gang, he still was incredibly and intensely interested in politics, to the point where in various elections he could name the Republicans standing in a county, 10 states across from New York where he lived, because he was intensely interested in the process. But to me, it's just like watching the mafia. Imagine the government is just the Mafia Crime Commission of Manhattan, and all the political parties are just various mafia gangs trying to rule the crime commission. That's how I see it. And although I did pay intense interest to this, just as Murray Rothbard did a few years ago, I found it very, very frustrating, and I was not wanting to launch bricks into the television, various fatuous comments that politicians made, but it was just stressing me out just watching this stuff. So I've deliberately decided for this election just to stand back and stand away. And it's been great. I've been really relaxed. I've really enjoyed myself. I've been enjoying the spring sunshine, and I haven't let all these silly squabbling angels dancing on the head of a pin worry me whatsoever. And the thing about the modern democratic process is, as kind of Karl Marx and Bakunin said, democracy is just the slow road to socialism. And as democracy has, I think the reason it's breaking down now and just becoming this quivering jelly of lots of little parties fighting tooth and nail over the tiniest scraps in order to affect the situation, I think it's Marx's prediction coming true that democracy is the road to socialism, and we're gradually moving towards a very, very socialist state, one election at a time.
Listeners will find links to our previous interviews on the page containing this one, and the one that we did about democracy, about the book actually called Democracy, the God That Failed, which you came on generously to do because the author didn't have time. That demonstrated in one memorable instance how serfs in feudal Britain in some ways were distinctly better off than a lot of people think they are today, simply in terms of, fruits of their labour, how much of their own time they had. And there were certain harsh elements to the system, but it sounds fatuous. But if you actually look at it and don't try and make comparisons between, the Middle Ages and now in terms of comforts, sanitation and all the rest of it, there were some advantages to living under a system like that.
Well, this is, if people watch a video, I think by Stefan Molyneux on YouTube, it's a fantastic video, one of his best, and that's about how people invented farming about 10,000 years ago, growing crops. It was because of a sort of mini ice age at the time dried the earth out, and particularly in places like the Middle East and in China and Mesoamerica, it got so dry that all the game animals disappeared, so people had to do something to survive. So what they did is they started growing grass. And so they grew grass, they grew maize in Mesoamerica, they grew rice in China, and they grew wheat in the Middle East. And therefore, we got a sedentary population. I think it's very interesting that the next big idea was to farm people. Because as soon as people became sedentary, weren't nomadic, and were in one place and tied to one place by farming, other people could then farm them. They could come along with weapons and just say to them, give us 10% of your wheat, otherwise things won't go so well for you. And this process of farming people, they were the first states. The leaders of these gangs, these bandit gangs, became the first kings and rulers of states, the Pharaoh of Egypt and so on. And gradually these states have been attacking each other. There were thousands and thousands of states to start with, thousands of bandit gangs, and they've been gradually attacking and coalescing and merging with each other to the point now where we have 200 tax farms on the planet, one of them being the United Kingdom, and to the point where there's virtually nowhere where you can go where these tax farms don't exist. And we're all tax cattle, and we have our tax cattle badges called passports, which effectively label us as farm animals, as tax farm animals. And this whole process of farming people, you can't get a couple of million people to farm 100 million people. What you've got to do to them is to persuade them that they're not living on a farm, and you have to do to them what was done to Neo in The Matrix when he was a computer programmer at the start of the movie. You've got to fool everyone into thinking that this is the best that life can be. So this is why we have the constant propaganda terms of liberty and democracy. It should be liberty or democracy, because all democracy is other people voting to take my stuff from me via their agents, the state. Now, if I was in London and a mafia commission set itself up and said, vote for us and then we'll go and rob other people and give things to you, that would be absolutely obviously criminal to everybody. But when it's done by the state, because we've all put ourselves in a goldfish bowl that we can't see out of, we tend to think that it's wonderful that we get to vote. To me, these politicians are just entertainment. They're just literally angels dancing on the head of a pin. They get very, very upset and obsessed about tiny, tiny differences in policies, whether the pension for pensioners is going to be £19.42 or £19.56. whether we're going to spend 10.11% of GDP on the NHS this year or 10.12% of GDP on the NHS this year. It's absolutely meaningless. If voting changed anything, they wouldn't let us do it. But one of its great purposes, and this is why they did voting in places like Iraq under Saddam Hussein and in the Soviet Union, where it was virtually compulsory to vote, is voting is a way of making people think that they have some control over their lives, when all we're all just tax cattle, and we're all just being made to think that things are wonderful, because if we think the system's good, then we're going to be at our most productive. We're going to generate the most tax for these criminals in government to take from us.
Three things arising from that. One is that, I guess, we think about the royal family in the UK and elsewhere, but particularly here in the UK, and how wonderful they are for the economy. And these are basically the descendants of people who took the land by force. I mean, maybe they didn't do it, but it's the same lineage. The other thing was about democracy in America. They bang on about that when North America is not a democracy. And third, these are unrelated somewhat points, but thinking about the minimum wage, you're talking about, salami slicing statistics and percentages and all the rest of it. And they're talking in here in the UK about putting up the minimum wage from £7 or £6 something as it is now, almost £7 to £8 by 2020. And the first thing I thought when I heard that was A, exactly what you said, but B, well, what's the rate of inflation going to do to prices by that time, given that the rate of inflation is grossly understated anyway?
Well, if we go back to the royal family, of course, I mean, everyone loves them, and, who would be without Kate and her lovely baby and her babies? But what are the royal family? They come from the Normans, and the Normans were a really aggressive gang of a mixture of Northern Franks and Norwegian Vikings, which blended together over a couple hundred years with a kind of history and a culture of being extremely violent. They invaded England. Nobody here wanted them. They took over. They brought their flag with them, which was the bloody cross of Christ given to them by the Pope. Well, they probably paid the Pope to give it to them, which is now currently still the flag of England, the bloody cross of Christ, which was brought by the Normans in the invasion of England. It's not an Anglo-Saxon flag at all. And then there was a revolution in the north of England, which almost unseated the Normans. And then they scoured the north. They killed virtually, I mean, you can search it on Wikipedia. They killed virtually everybody in the north of England. They just sent gangs of soldiers around the country, around the north of England, who tried to revolt. And anyone they found, they just killed them, there and then. And to this point in time, that's one of the reasons why the north of England is a little bit less crowded than the south of England, because of this scouring of the north. And this is the foundation of the modern royal family that we absolutely love. The minimum wage, of course, is all you have to do is read Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson to find out all about the minimum wage. If I'm an employer, let's say I run a fast food shop, and I need some help, and if I take this person on, that person can make me, let's say £10 an hour more. If you force me to pay him £11 an hour or her £11 an hour, then I just won't take them on in the first place. The minimum wage creates unemployment. People like government bodies, of course, can afford to put wages up because they tax the rest of us. But then that decreases the wealth in the rest of society when they take money from us to increase their minimum wages within government departments. And of course, governments as well can also print money out of thin air to increase the amount of money they have to spend on themselves and their friends. And of course, that just dilutes the wealth of the rest of us. I can't remember your second point.
Oh, it was just a quick point saying, about democracy, that, they're talking about democracy in Iraq and democracy in Afghanistan, these places that are, tribal history, and they're a different type of state. But I threw in the fact that the USA was not set up as a democracy, and yet that's all the parties over there talk about.
Well, I'm not that knowledgeable on the history of the United States, though I have read a couple of years ago now Murray Rothbard's 4-volume book, Conceived in Liberty, I think, which is a fantastic book. If anyone's out there, when I was looking to buy this book, I think it was like $250 on Amazon as a second-hand book. And then Jeff Tucker, God bless him, brought it out as a PDF, and I actually bought the books from the Mises Institute for $50 or something. And it's a fantastic book about the history of the United States, which interprets American history through the lens of Austrian economics, which is brilliant. But America is definitely not founded as a democracy where someone like Obama could become pharaoh. Jefferson particularly, and people like Jefferson, wanted it to be a republic, and they wanted the states to be virtually independent of each other. And the Federalists railroaded the United States state together when Jefferson was in Paris in France. And when he came back, it was a fait accompli. It had already been done. The deal was done, and they'd created not these United States, but the United States. I don't know that too much about the origins of the democracy in the United States, but it was founded as a republic of independent territories, and then was gradually federalized together into the monolith that we see today.
This is why people who oppose the EU in general say, because it's headed in that direction, one independent states then chose to work together and cooperate in certain fields, but it's headed in this direction of like one monolithic, it's now called the European Union.
Well, we've been boiled into that like frogs, haven't we? Unfortunately, I'm just about old enough to remember Margaret Thatcher campaigning for it wasn't called the EU then, it was called the EEC, I seem to remember, it's a long, long time ago now, she was wearing a jumper covered in the different flags of what is now the EU. And we've been sleptwalked into that one stage at a time. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm campaigning for UKIP, but I see the future hopefully as one of secession. As the states grow and as they coalesce into kind of George Orwell's three superpowers of Eurasia, East Asia and Oceania, which we seem to have now. We seem to have a kind of coalition growing between Moscow and Beijing. We've got the Washington thing going on, and we've also got the Brussels thing going on. Though I do actually think personally that the EU is a creature and an invention of the United States government more than anything else. I mean, other people would disagree with that. But we've got these three kind of superpowers growing. As we get more and more socialism, we get more and more poverty and chaos and things breaking down and arguments and everything going wrong. And people will say, we don't need to put up with this. I mean, if you do a little thought experiment, you can probably see this. If democracy is such a wonderful thing, and it's liberty and democracy, freedom and democracy, rather than liberty or democracy and freedom or democracy, then why don't we have a world government with a world democratic election in which everyone can vote? So we'll just have one world government, it decides everything, and everyone in the world votes in an equal fashion. I think most people would do a thought experiment like that and would recoil in horror at the implications, because everyone would know exactly what would happen. The Chinese and the Indians, because of sheer weight of numbers, several billion people, would take over the government, and the government would then pour all the resources of the world into Asia and drain the rest of us. So if a world government with world democracy would be bad, and just think that through, it probably makes sense that it would be bad to anyone who wasn't in a hugely populous country, then why is it good at the smaller scale of, say, even the United Kingdom? So I think as all these countries coalesce and democracy grows and this monster called democracy grows, chaos will increase and people will try to get away, and we'll see a much greater increase in secessionary movements, and that's what I'm banking on. We're starting to see that in the UK now. We almost had Scotland going independent, which was a real terrible shame they didn't, although me and you both predicted that it wouldn't happen, but it was close. I hope it will happen. We'll see, hopefully, England and Wales and the rest of the UK breaking away from the EU as the EU becomes ever more chaotic. And hopefully we'll see a complete breakdown of everywhere, really. I want the whole world to secede. I want the Basque territory to secede from Spain, Catalonia to secede from Spain. I want Brittany to secede from France. I want everywhere to secede from everywhere. I would love to see the United States break down, with Texas going, and then Alaska, and then various other places, New Hampshire, who knows. we saw the great release of energy when the Eastern monolith in Eastern Europe broke down. So when the Warsaw Pact fell apart, that created a huge explosion in liberty and freedom and wealth in Estonia and Eastern Europe and the Czech Republic, and even Russia itself, of course, has become far wealthier because the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact fell apart. So hopefully the future will be one of secession. I think democracy has it within itself the seeds of its own destruction, because it is a slow road to socialism. So we have the Bolsheviks wanting revolution to get to socialism, and we have the Mensheviks wanting democracy to get to socialism. They're both roads to the same place. It creates chaos, and people don't like chaos, and people will shy away from it. And we've had lots of participatory democracy in the UK now for 150, 200 years, since various reform acts in the 19th century. And that's why it's all starting to fall apart now. It's had long enough to become just a big quivering jelly mass of nothingness. We've got the blue socialists, and their friends are farmers and people in the city. We've got the red socialists. Their friends are Guardian readers, people working for the state, and people working for local authorities. And we've got the yellow socialists, who are somewhere between the two, who knows. And then we've got lots of other little socialist gangs, nationalist and socialist nationalist gangs, all fighting for their own bit of the turf, their own piece of the cake, usually taken from the rest of us by force, by the Inland Revenue and I won't call them laws, by the tens of thousands of regulations imposed by these mafia gangs, these rulers who completely manipulate our lives.
I was going to say that for people new to all this, what you're advocating may sound like a recipe for chaos, but you've just answered the point anyway, which is like, well, what do you think we've got now, and what do you think's been increasing for the last decades and centuries, even if you want to go that far back? Quick point about the minimum wage, which you addressed earlier. I just want to say there's a lot about, because that's a very sensitive topic for a lot of people who can't get by and people who are on the minimum wage and people who empathize with people who are. There's a lot about the current system that presupposes that people are bad, basically. And me personally, if I had a company or a business, whatever it happened to be, and as you pointed out, there's certain levels at which I need to price things to make a profit. And if I bring a new employee in, and the first thing in my mind is going to be, okay, do the calculations here. What can I afford to pay this employee? And I'll put it to them and say, I can offer you X amount of work for X amount of money. And if they can either accept it or not accept it, I couldn't sleep at night if I was rubbing my hands in the back room and just saying, oh, I can fuck this guy over and exploit him, and make an extra couple of quid an hour out of him. I don't care how he lives, because that presupposes that everyone's like that. I would want someone working for me to be delighted to be working for me. So therefore, I'm not going to screw every last penny I can out of them. I want them to be able to go home to their family and just say, this is a good job. The guy plays fair with me. I'm happy.
I think this is a development of an Italian socialist called Gramsci, who was a very important Marxist in the early 20th century. And he is the founder of political correctness. He is the one who makes us feel guilty about everything. So he's the one who, when I own a fast food restaurant and I can only afford to pay £10 and I get told I have to pay 11 and I'm only making 10 off this person, so I don't take them on, and then I don't sleep at night thinking how evil I am. He's the one who said this is another way to socialism. What you've got to do is you've got to have two kinds of persuasion. You've got to have the stick and the carrot. The stick is government regulation, state regulation, to say, you cannot refuse to serve certain people. You cannot smoke in a pub. You cannot do this. You cannot do that. But also you need to have sort of subtle coercive, cultural coerciveness as well, which is political correctness. So maybe your listeners might just go to Wikipedia, take a look at Gramsci. That's Gramsci, an incredibly important socialist, one of the key socialists in the Marxism Today movement, which led to New Labour, which led to Tony Blair. And his big idea was a thing called cultural hegemony. And that's where you use the intellectuals to persuade the rest of us how bad we are. So democracy becomes a religion in that way, in the same way that Catholicism, you repent your sins every week. Those of us who believe in freedom are supposed to repent our need for freedom and to join this amorphous socialist mass. And very, very influential socialist, Gramsci. And if people don't like political correctness and don't like all of this movement that way, he is the one responsible. So maybe you might want to find out about him.
Well, of course, there are people, the opposite side of what I was speaking about a moment ago. There are greedy people, greedy employers, exploiters who will take advantage of people, particularly vulnerable people, for their own gain. And there's always been people like that. There's been good people, bad people, and everything between ever since. And this is a bigger question that we maybe can't address in any detail now, but it's partly a function, part of this grasping and climbing over the other people to get ahead and getting what you can before somebody else does, is a side effect of the system that we live under. It creates this feeling of like, I've got to get that before somebody else does.
I think, yes, Robert Lefebvre, I can never pronounce the name correctly. Again, there's some great tapes available from the Mises Institute with the thoughts of Robert Lefebvre, said that when you introduce violence into society, and let's just believe me for a minute. Let's imagine that we are living as tax cattle on a tax farm. The state are basically the farmers. All the people working for the government are the farm hands, and the rest of us who generate all the wealth, we are the tax cattle, tax sheep, whatever. Let's just believe that that is actually true. Well, as the cattle and as the sheep, even if we believe that we're in the right place, we still feel this violence towards us from these people pushing us around and telling us what to do and stealing our fleeces on a regular basis. And this violence that we feel, we're told and we believe that this is for our own good, this coercive system of violence which the state runs, constantly hounding us with speed cameras and telling us what to do and telling us who we can see and telling us we can't smoke this substance and telling us we must eat this substance. This violence then comes out of us and gets pushed on to the next person down the chain. And Robert Lefebvre was a big believer in this, that the violence that's imposed upon us by the state comes through us and gets directed onto other people. But I just want to take one of your earlier points a little bit further. I think the most bad people in society, where they gravitate towards, isn't towards running a bad fast food restaurant, because, all the people who worked in a bad fast food restaurant would go and work for a nice fast food restaurant if there was another choice available. I think most of the bad people in society, most of the evil impulses in society, they tend to head towards government work. They tend to go towards places where they can order people around, where they can have their authority unquestioned, where they can take money off people. So the motivations of people, for instance, who work for the Inland Revenue, I wouldn't like to, they might think they're doing a good job, but I think probably a lot of them enjoy, in fact, for my sins, I actually know someone, I won't say the name, who enjoy making other people suffer by sending them threatening letters, by just generally being an unpleasant person. I think evil people do tend to head towards the state. And we've seen that in the 20th century, of course, where we've seen some really rotten, evil states around the world, all of them socialist. And where do all the bad people in society gravitate towards? They gravitate towards the powerful departments within those various government bodies. So I think, yes, we'll never abolish evil in society if you define evil as taking other people's stuff against their will by hurting other people and breaking the basic main commandments of the Bible or whichever religious book you follow. But I think most of the more evil people in society actually aren't running private businesses. I think most of them end up working for the government.
Yesterday, you just reminded me of this, and if you're listening to this and you're a traffic warden, I'm not talking about traffic wardens as a race of people here, but yesterday I was walking along. It was Sunday. It was a very quiet street, and I saw two traffic wardens, a guy and a girl, kind of leaning on a wall, peering around the corner. And I was walking along, I wonder what they're doing. Are they hiding from someone? And then I heard that she went, yes. and they both dashed round the corner, and I rounded the corner, and they were up putting a ticket on a car, and it's clear what had happened. A guy pulled up and he put his car on a double yellow line, got out, and they were watching and waiting until he went away. Now, presumably, even in an anarcho-capitalist society, we might have some controls on what people do, and in your area, if you collectively got together and say we want to control the car parking around here, and everyone agrees, and we'll do it. But if I was that traffic warden, you could have gone up to the guy and said, "Oh, excuse me, you can't park here," But they waited for him to go.
Well, I think that's a perfect illustration of what I was just talking about. There's lots of that going on. But these people, of course, they're feeling harassed because the public, I'm sure, are fairly unpleasant to traffic wardens on a regular basis. Yeah. So they're passing on that. In Robert Lefebvre's view, to interpret the man, they're passing on that negative feeling onto other people. But who knows what we'd have in an anarcho-capitalist society? That's the problem. We don't know. We can't predict what we'll have because we haven't tried it yet. But let's just imagine that roads are privately owned. We can do it now. Let us say that there's a town or a big area, a big estate, which is privately owned. With maybe a gate on the front, just for fun. First of all, you wouldn't be allowed into that area unless you had a special permit. And you'd have to pay for that permit. You'd be a resident in the area, or you'd own a business in that area, and the estate owner would have granted you permission. So let's take Centre Parks for an example. Centre Parks in the UK, most people have been to Centre Parks or know what Centre Parks is. That's a private area owned by a private. It's sort of almost anarcho-capitalist. You've got roads there and you've got security guards there, but it's all completely private and the state is not there. So what would they do if somebody was badly parked? Well, you can't get into Centre Parks unless you have a ticket from Centre Parks saying you can come here. They stop you from parking in particular areas by closing gates. And if you are parked in a bad area, what they will do is they will phone you up and they will say to you, "You're parked in a bad area. Can you come and move your car, please? Otherwise, we'll have to take it away and put it in a special area, and then you'll be able to pick it up from there later." What they wouldn't do is they wouldn't stand around a corner waiting for you to go, and then as soon as you've gone, stick a £50 fine on the car for you, because that's bad for business. It's not nice, it's unpleasant, and it's bad for business. Now, obviously, you're about to be hit by a plethora of letters from people at Centre Parks have been. I've never ever seen anyone at Centre Parks being fined £50 for parking in the wrong place. They just had the private security get onto them and say, "Move your car, otherwise we'll have to move it for you." So I think in a private society, yes, of course, we'll have bad people. We'll have people parking in the wrong place. But I want you to imagine everything in that framework of what would be done here if this was private. I think a good actual mental experiment, for instance, with the religion of the NHS in this country is to think, what would a national food service be like? Not a national health service, a national food service. If the government ran all of the food distribution, so they owned and ran Sainsbury's, Tesco's, Waitrose, all the other food distribution outlets, what would that be like? It would be absolutely horrible, wouldn't it? There'd be queues, there'd be wasted food, there'd be special back doors for bureaucrats to get ahead of the queues.
What you mean like the Soviet Union, basically?
Yeah, it would basically, that's what a national food service would be like. Well, the NHS is exactly the same. So it would be much, much better if it was ran privately, but people just cannot conceive of that because of this taboo, this religion, this sacred cow aspect of the National Health Service. But just always imagine, what would this be like ran by the state? What would this be like ran by privately? And you can generally get a good flavour of the evil of the state. So just think, what would the National Food Service be like? What do we have now? We have a hugely regulated food distribution industry with massive government intrusions and rules, but it's still mostly private and still works very well. And I can still get Stilton cheese, and for instance, and Gewürztraminer wine. What would a state-run thing be like? Well, I could only get Stilton cheese and Gewürztraminer wine if I was a senior fonctionnaire of a big important government department, whereas I'd be queuing around the back for rotten potatoes. So that's how I always try to see everything. How would this be done in an anarcho-capitalist private society, as opposed to how's it being done now by the state?
Well, of course, I know that a lot of people out there, if they're new to some of the idea, because what you're talking about, this anarcho-capitalist idea, a lot of people going, what the hell is that? This is something that's beyond the obvious disadvantages of state-run, but also, privatization gets a lot of demonization in the media and by politicians, and there are plenty of examples of privatization within a sort of state system where things go badly wrong. I would just say, because we already did a show on this, but Anarcho-Capitalism, if people are interested, they can find the show, and maybe just for people who are genuinely interested in this sort of third way, what's one of the best books you've ever read on the subject?
Oh, well, it's got to be Democracy, the God That Failed. There's a really good annotated bibliography by Hans Hermann Hoppe. So just do a search on Google, do Hans Hermann Hoppe, and then do annotated bibliography of anarchism, and then on there you'll get about 10, 15 books. I think I've read most of them, if not all of them. So on there we have The Machinery of Freedom. We've got Bruce Benson's Enterprise of Law. We've got Democracy, the God That Failed. We've got Economics in One Lesson, I think. Just search for that and you'll come up with a really good annotated bibliography. But really, eventually, you have to come back to Murray Rothbard. So Murray Rothbard is, to me, to use another New York mafia term, he is the godfather of Austrian economics. And it always comes back to Murray Rothbard. So in the end, it all comes down to economics as well. And in the end, you have to come to Man, Economy and State with Power and Market by Murray Rothbard if you want to get into full anarcho-capitalism. Sorry, I'm taking your debate away from the British election, which I'm not following because I'm an anarcho-capitalist.
Oh, that's quite all right. I mean, this is all relevant. This is all relevant because we're not here, as I said earlier, to kind of pick apart the policies of the UK parties. If people are looking for that, they can go elsewhere. The whole point of this is to do something different, and we're trying to take it beyond that. But on the UK election note, we've seen the rise of you may not have been paying attention, but you'll still be aware of what's happened with the Scottish National Party, because we did a show on that, the rise of UKIP and other parties across the other side of things on the left, and this era of coalitions, and we've just had the one just gone. But it's been decades since the Conservative Party actually had an outright victory in terms of numbers, and it seems that that's what we're going into now, an era of coalitions that are going to be messy, ineffectual, and it's going to be even more grubbing around on the ground amongst the gravel looking for bits of chicken feed.
Well, it's I seem to recall that the Italians had a long period like this. Maybe they're still in that long period.
Well, in the Germans, they run coalitions all the time, I think.
Yeah, well, it just gives the lie to democracy, doesn't it? Because Margaret Thatcher, in her pomp, would win huge governments on 40%. This gives the lie to democracy, of course. Democracy is supposed to be about the majority. Yet she would win huge government victories with 40%. And even now, if the Conservative Party got 40% just for the Conservative Party, they would have a huge crushing victory, which gives lie to this idea that it's the majority, because the left made the great mistake, of course, of splitting down the middle. You had the liberals on one side of the kind of the kind of university professor lecturer socialists in the liberals, and then you had the local authority functionaries in the Labour Party, and they had and trade union leaders and so on. So you had that split in the left movement, but they've kind of come together slowly, which is and the Conservative Party, if it wants to survive within the goldfish bowl of politics, has had to become more socialist over time, to the point where David Cameron is espousing policies now which Gramsci would have been completely happy with. And of course, democracy over the last 100 years has given us virtually everything that Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto wanted. It's given us huge progressive income taxes. It's given us central banking, and all these things are in the Communist Manifesto. It's got the centralization of communication in the hands of the state. So we've got the BBC, and even if communication agencies aren't owned and run by the government like the BBC is, then they are completely heavily regulated by the government. So I think there's various other points in the Communist Manifesto, such as the government running all the schools, which in order to brainwash them into believing in the state. And it works. I mean, it does work. This is why we can't see through things, because most of us either been through a state education system or even in a private education system, one that's been heavily regulated and is mirroring the state system. We've been to universities which are state financed and run. So we've had our brains kind of washed. So if I print some money in a basement, it's called counterfeiting. And when the Bank of England prints money in a basement, it's called managing the money supply. When I hurt somebody, it's called violence, or it's a terrible thing. When the government hurts somebody, it's called defending freedom. We cannot see through this. When somebody puts on a government cloak and wears a government badge, suddenly they stop being a human being and they start being angels, and all goodness emanates from them. Whereas the rest of us who are paying for all of this, who are subsidizing and funding all of this, are judged by the Gramscian socialists as evil and constantly having our words assessed, as in the kind of George Orwell newspeak methodology. We're constantly having the past changed and things written out of the past in this kind of 1984 fashion. And so all this kind of all these political parties are merged basically into one, and things do come through my curtain. I do occasionally imbibe the odd little bit of election fever. I try to avoid it as much as I can, though it is difficult. And you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I heard something along the lines of, my life is going to be regulated over the next 4 or 5 years by some people in Scotland who don't even want to be part of the UK in order to buy a few of their votes in Parliament in order for one of these quivering coalitions to have some power so that it can be their turn to sit in the government limousines for the next 4 years, rather than another gang of clowns for it to be their turn in the limousines for the next 4 years. And in the background, of course, the civil service is just laughing at all of this because they're the real government. And these people at the top are just people who come and go. I actually saw that when I was at university, when I was heavily involved with a students' union. And I realized that the people running the Students' Union were the bureaucracy behind it, and all these presidents of the Students' Union and everything were just people who just came and went. And of course, many of them went on to become political figures, particularly within the Labour Party and within the Liberals and possibly the Conservatives as well. And again, politicians, they're just window dressing. They're just entertainment. I think, though, this could sow the seeds of some disillusionment with democracy, because obviously, if voting made any difference, they wouldn't allow us to do it. But we must at least be given the thought that our votes are making a difference. When we enter an age of perpetual coalitions, it becomes obvious even to people inside the goldfish bowl that their vote really is completely meaningless, and all that's happening is there is a table in Whitehall with 50 seats around it, and the politicians, in the best tradition of Jonathan Swift and Gulliver's Travels, are just pushing each other and fighting each other to play musical chairs, to be the one to sit down when the music stops, with the real business of government, of course, being done by the civil service, who never change anyway.
When I was at university, I looked into getting on the staff of the university or the student newspaper as a possible way into journalism. And then I met the people who were running it. And no, but it did occur to me. I'm sure they weren't all evil people or anything, but it did occur to me when I was looking at the posters, which during election time for the union president and vice president and minister for rural affairs or whatever it was, that inside the toilet cubicles is where they would post their blurbs.
Well, that probably says it all, actually.
Yeah, it does. But it did occur to me. I worked out pretty quick. Yeah, this is part of the ladder. In the same way that, if you're a prefect at your grammar school, and then, it's all part of the structure, and then you meet the right people and all the rest of it. And, but on your point about people's disillusionment with democracy, I think that one aspect of that has been manifested by this convergence of policies that we've been alluding to. where my expression is that you can't get a cigarette paper between the main parties in terms of policy. And even now, some of what used to be called fringe parties are starting to overlap. So it's all becoming one big blur. And I think that has contributed. But I think a lot of people feel they've grown up with this system. That's all they've known. It's all they can imagine. They see other alternatives, more, authoritarian and totalitarian around the world. And, we don't want that. And it just blinkers them that there could be any other way of doing things. And this manifests itself in the vox pops that you'll hear in the media around election time is, I'm Labour, me, just like my father and my grandfather before me. And it almost didn't matter. I mean, Labour could come round and boil their children alive, and they would be Labour. They would be Labour because there was generations their family were Labour, and that's another manifestation of it. You don't know where else to go.
I think it was like in Sunderland. They didn't used to count the Labour votes. They used to weigh them, which I think's fantastic. So. Yeah, we get people think, I am a Labour person, I am a Conservative person, whatever, and it's historical within my family. But I think as this, I think this crisis of 2007, that was put off by a huge amount of money printing. It hasn't gone away. It's still there. It's just hiding in various central banking excess reserve accounts, waiting to come out. I think when that crisis is finally allowed to happen, or it comes out regardless of whether they want it to happen, and hits us, and then we've got these politicians running around just blaming everyone else but themselves for having caused this mess. I think that will then focus people's minds. But I think what it's coming out as, I think people are intelligent. They've had this, and I've had this massive brainwashing over my life. I went to a state school. I had this massive socialist brainwashing. I was a socialist for many years. It took me 20 years to shake off these idiotic nostrums. I think people subconsciously realize that there's something missing. Again, a bit like Neo in the Matrix movie. He knows something's wrong. He doesn't know quite what it is. He sees these politicians bickering. And this is the thing, of course. Occasionally when I do catch the tail end of Newsnight, when I'm actually trying to watch Game of Thrones, I'll see these politicians getting really angry with each other, really being nasty with each other and shouting at each other. And they're arguing about the tiniest differences in policy. I mean, I don't know this election because I haven't followed it that well deliberately, but the last election, I think I worked out that the politicians were arguing tooth and nail over about £10 billion worth of spending differences. So the Conservatives were planning to spend something like 690 billion, and the Labour Party were planning to spend 700 billion, and the vitriol that they were pouring over each other. So the Tories are saying, you're going to bankrupt society by spending this extra 10 billion. And the Labour Party saying, you're going to pauperise society by not spending this 10 billion. On a budget of around 700 billion, I can't work out the percentages quickly, which gives lie to the fact I'm a financial trainer. But that's a tiny difference, like a 1% difference in spending. And they were just arguing. Again, this is Karl Marx. He was right. I mean, he was an evil man, but he was an intelligent man. And he realized that when you give 51 people the right to vote, so that 49 other people are going to be fleeced, which is essentially what democracy comes down to, or in Bastiat's kind of interpretation, the great myth that we can all live by stealing off everyone else. Once you give people that right, and once people participate in that process, even if they're on the losing side, they try to win, so they have to therefore log roll and give up their resources to the 51% of people who did win. When you kick that process off, then you will head towards socialism. But fortunately, this is where I'm an optimist. The more socialism we have, the more chaos we have, therefore the whole thing will fall apart, and then we'll secede from each other. And then hopefully Scotland will secede, Wales will secede, Cornwall, Kernow, the Republic of Kernow will secede, the Free Republic of Henley-on-Thames will secede, and the whole thing will will fall apart into. I mean, you're saying, "Oh, this is chaos." Earlier, I mean, is Monaco chaotic? Is Singapore chaotic? Is Andorra chaotic? Is Liechtenstein chaotic? Other small cantons of Switzerland, are they chaotic? No, they're peaceful, wealthy. They don't go around invading anywhere. They don't have terrorist problems. You know, apart from, say, with Monaco having the constant looming threat of the French hanging over them, which is one reason why the Monaco Grand Prix is such a great thing, because it highlights Monaco every year and maybe prevents the French from ever thinking that they might take that over. So I think the whole thing is going to reach a crisis point. I think we'll all realise that these politicians are just fools, basically, just playing musical chairs with each other. And secession will be the order of the day, and things will break apart, and hopefully we can head into hopefully this will all be done completely peacefully. I'm a completely peaceful person. Then we can head towards the future without this belief in freedom and democracy. It's not freedom and democracy. It's freedom or democracy.
I recently read E.F. Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful. And that was quite an influence on, the environmental movement. But it occurred to me that some of the points he made in there, you could map over into political entities. He was talking mainly about companies and about, environmental impact and how, in fact, how just once you get past a certain size and the company is metastasizing, you don't get economies of scale anymore. If someone's listening to this and thinking, okay, well, we were listening to the debate about Scottish independence, and we weren't persuaded that just if Scotland broke off from the rest of the UK, that they'd be able to make a go of it. Why should things necessarily work better if they're in smaller units? And, how small do they have to be? Obviously, there's no right answer to this, but some people might say, well, you're just going to get the same problems, but on a smaller scale.
Well, no, I think we saw with the case of something like IBM and Microsoft. IBM was back in the good old days, was this huge monolith with tens and tens of thousands of employees all wearing blue suits, looked completely powerful, ran all the computers in the world. And this Microsoft was 4 guys in Hawaiian shirts. And Microsoft completely took them over. Microsoft completely took apart IBM and wrecked it. And the same's happening to Microsoft. We've seen Microsoft become this huge monolith with tens of thousands of employees, and now we're seeing other companies starting to take it apart. I know it's Apple's one of them, which is another big company, but we constantly see this again and again. These huge monoliths with layers and layers and layers and layers of bureaucrats get stuck in this kind of monolithic place where they're completely unagile. They can't change. And then a tiny little thing like 4 people from Microsoft can come in and totally restructure the entire environment. This has happened again and again and again, and it will continue to happen. And if people want more on that process, beyond reading the Small is Beautiful book, which is, I think, showing its age a little bit now, I think the book to get is Rework. I just found it on Amazon for you. It's by David Heinemeier, and he helped create Ruby on Rails, which is a web development platform. And he ran the company, I think, called 37 Signals. And I think his company is, it's only about 50 people, yet it generates tens of millions of dollars of revenue each year because they just run things in a very tiny way. They're following the Schumacher idea of small is beautiful. My favorite personal example along the lines of the IBM Microsoft line of thinking is McDonald's. Because I was reading, I think it was in the book Fast Food Nation, which is, I was going back, it must have been close to 15 years now. But anyway, that McDonald's started out as, I think it was in LA, but it was the best burger stand in town. And people flocked from all over the city to go to it. So eventually, hey, they opened 2, to put one somewhere else in the city. And then they had 3, and then they had 4, and then 100 years later, they had 50 million billion serving up absolute dog shit. And they'd be much better. If anybody wants a great burger now, they're going to the equivalents of the original McDonald's, which is handmade, locally sourced, all the rest of it. So it's a repeating pattern, and we can learn from this. Yeah, actually, strangely enough, one of my favourite burger places in the world is in Los Angeles, and it's directly under the takeoff flight path of Los Angeles Airport. So as you get your burger, you look up, you've got planes that feel like they're about 50 feet above your head. And it's a fantastic place. So I do recommend people look for that. Just go to the end of the runway at LAX Airport, and hopefully it's still there. It was a couple of years since I've been there. But again, this monolith thing, let's go back to this monolith thing. One of the reasons why these monoliths survive, these huge monoliths, is because of government again. Because what government does is it imposes big companies, when they can see smaller competition coming along about to take their cheese from them, what they do is they badger the government to bring in rules to prevent the competition. So what we end up with is these huge, expensive monoliths, which aren't really serving the public anymore, but it's government privilege which is keeping them alive. So, let's say in terms of fast food, there'll be all sorts of restrictions about who you can employ and what reports you have to send to the government once you go over 50 employees and so on. So there'll be all sorts of rules which prevent people taking apart these big monoliths. Occasionally, the people have enough about them. Let's say Richard Branson with Virgin Atlantic. I mean, Freddie Lake had tried to break the British Airways, previously government-owned monolith, and failed. But then he took his consultancy skills to Virgin Atlantic 20 years later and helped them finally break the monolith of British Airways. So people can occasionally break through, even with massive, massive government protection. And also, again, with poverty, why does poverty keep persisting? Well, one of the reasons poverty persists, let's say you're paying somebody £10 an hour and they feel, and maybe you feel, it's not enough for them to live on. Why is that? The reason why is because most of that money is going in tax. So £5 will be disappearing. Well, they hide it, of course. In this country, they'll call £2 of that employer's national insurance tax. So the person never even sees that on their paycheck. So they think they're only getting £8 an hour. Then they'll take another £2 employees' national insurance tax. That'll take it down to £6. Then they'll take another £2 and call that income tax. So now they're down to £4 from the original 10 that you paid them. And then when they go shopping or whatever, they'll buy a can of beer. Well, that'll have tax on it. They'll buy some cigarettes. Even, they'll break Gramsci's cultural taboos because the intellectuals have decided they don't like cigarette smoking. So the state will do anything it can to keep the support of the intellectuals. So it will bring in all sorts of things about smoking. So they're paying huge tax on that. They take a flight to Ireland. They'll be paying tax on the flight. They'll be paying tax every time they get fuel for their car. They have to pay the BBC tax. They have no choice about that. So if you want to help, if people want to help people become wealthier, particularly the poorer end of the social scale, how about just cutting and removing taxes? How about shrinking government? How about getting rid of the BBC, making the BBC work, privately, sell it off? Stop its BBC tax of £100 a year. Get rid of all these other taxes. Keep sacking government regulators who do nothing but go around trying to stymie other people who get a big thrill or even get promoted because they can find people to harass. That's the way to remove poverty from society, not by victimizing a few entrepreneurs who are trying to make a living, but by removing taxes and removing government officials. And also taking away the privileges from big monolithic companies which have worked with government to give themselves these privileges to allow smaller companies to come in and provide better, cheaper services for the rest of society, which again will take people out of poverty because prices will be cheaper, things will be more efficient, and so on. So that to me is how you get rid of poverty. You get rid of government.
Thinking about the role of the media in all this, the wider arena that we've been discussing, but also back again to the original subject, the UK election, this current one, previous ones. Whether it's the BBC, I mean, I know in our show that we did about the Scottish independence vote, I'm sure we discussed, at least in passing, the media's role in this, particularly the BBC, because I felt that, and some people attacked me when I talked about this, that I felt the BBC was being very partisan and very unfair to the Scottish National Party. And I watched some of this coverage and they were just laying into them, sometimes publicly, in ways that they just were not doing with the main UK parties. And I see a lot of interesting wrinkles along these lines in the current election. And one thing I've noticed is, and I just don't know, I'm not going to strike a conspiratorial note, but they never seem to, this is the BBC and a lot of the other mainstream outlets, they never seem to find anyone articulate to speak to amongst the general public. Now, these people are out there. I mean, I regularly meet people who don't know what day it is or where they live. I regularly meet people who are incredibly switched on and should probably have their own media show, but they don't. And there's everything in between. But I get very frustrated when I listen to the BBC and other mainstream media talking to members of the public about election issues. It's incredibly inarticulate, or at least the quotes that they use are, it contributes nothing. It does nothing to call any of the parties really to account. It doesn't introduce any new ideas that might make people's ears prick up. But again, that's probably part of the structure we've talked about. The media, and to some extent, whether it's the BBC or otherwise, are in some way in bed with the state.
Oh, the media has always been in bed with the state. Pardon me. Back to the earliest times. If you think of the earliest 10,000 years ago when states started going, when they started going around these sedentary farmers taking 10% of their wheat in order for their lives not to be made more unpleasant, you had a small amount of people who, a small amount of violent people who formed the kind of soldiers of the state, but a huge number of farmers. Now, the farmers could have risen up and thrown off these small number of parasitizing soldiers, but they were persuaded that this was best for them. The state, or these gang of bandits writ large, have always employed intellectuals to campaign on the behalf of the gang in order to tell everyone else how good the gang is and why they're necessary. And in return, the intellectuals, who are generally fairly useless people, society doesn't really value them very much. It certainly wouldn't pay them professorial salaries of £250,000 a year or even £50,000 a year unless the state was subsidising that. And it wouldn't pay them the huge salaries that managers get at the BBC for not doing very much, £500,000 a year for producing, EastEnders and other hugely wonderful programmes like that. Unless the state was behind it. Now the state, the soldiers give the intellectuals these huge salaries, or some of the profits of the take, in order for the intellectuals to then propagandize on behalf of the state. So the purpose of the BBC, I mean, it's even in the name, the British Broadcasting Corporation. British always tends to mean the British government. That their job is to propagandize about how wonderful the British state is, whether that's left wing or right, or I'll say right wing is it's socialism but with a blue tinge. I mean, they go between socialism with a blue tinge to socialism with a red tinge, but mainly centre on socialism with a yellow tinge. It's government socialism of one kind or another that they're constantly broadcasting into your house. That's why there's such a concentration on BBC News, on Newsnight, various other programs that I can't even watch anymore because they just make my skin crawl. Constant. If you flipped into the dark side, or what I call the light side like I have, you can see this propaganda just being pumped at you. They call it programming for a reason. It's called news programming. The point of news programming is to convince us constantly that the government needs to intervene, the government needs to do more stuff. And if you ever do watch these big media, government-controlled, mainstream media, BBC-style programs, they're constantly, the underlying subtle framework, again, very Gramscian here, this kind of subcurrent of persuasion is that the government needs to intervene. So they'll step up with a situation. Problem X has just happened. We spoke to a government minister, and the government minister said, we're going to bring in a new rule to stop problem X. And then 6 months later, there's problem Y, which is being caused by the rule that was brought in. And the BBC will go and say, oh, there's this problem Y. What are you going to do, Minister? And the Minister will say, well, I'm going to bring in a new rule to stop problem Y. And so we get this constant creeping interventionism, and we get this duopoly, this little thing going on between the intellectuals and the rulers. There's only a small amount of parasitical rulers. Let's say it's 1 in 100 who are parasitical rulers, senior civil servants. and then there's a lot of the rest of us are just living our lives. Well, there'll be 2 or 3 intellectuals who are being paid somehow by the ruler to constantly tell the rest of us who are just getting on with our lives that everything is good, everything is fine. In really ancient times, these people were called witch doctors. So you'd have the violent soldiers, and then you'd have the witch doctor constantly telling you that you've got to do what the soldiers tell you, or the leader of the spearmen. And later on, these intellectuals became priests. And so the priests then invented this: be good in this life and do what the rulers tell you and you'll go to heaven. And priests were granted huge privileges. In ancient Egypt, they didn't pay tax. They were given huge amounts of land and so on. And all they had to do was keep pumping out the idea that the pharaoh was necessary. And this has continued. The BBC these days actually is quite strange, because we used to have the Church of England used to receive a tithe back in the 19th century, where you had to pay them 10% of your income, and they were hated for it. And then the priests, the Church of England priests, would then tell the whole population on a Sunday that the state is good, the state is wonderful, obey the state and everything will be great and you'll go to heaven. The same thing is going on now with the BBC. They have a tithe. It's called the BBC licence fee. It's just the same as the 19th century Church of England tithe. And in return for this tithe and the massive salaries some of their managers and so-called stars receive, is keep pumping out the message that the government is wonderful. Now, you don't have to say the Tory party is wonderful. You don't have to say the Labour Party is wonderful. You don't have to say the Liberal Party is wonderful. You just have to say the state is wonderful. The state is necessary. And on top of this, you have various taboos. So the NHS is wonderful and absolutely necessary. Everything, control of this and control of that and control of the other thing is absolutely necessary. So within the rubric of saying the state is wonderful, they are, on Newsnight, for instance, they are allowed to criticise Ed Miliband, or they are allowed to criticise David Cameron or whoever. But the basic message is the state is wonderful, the state is good. Keep voting citizens in your elections, just like they used to do in the Soviet Union and East Germany, and everything will be wonderful.
Well, just 2 little things before I move on. In my introduction to this broadcast, I did refer to it as a programme, so just forgive me for that, because that's the last thing we want to do here. And if you're living in the UK and you resent paying television license, but you do want to have a TV, one thing you can do, and you didn't hear this here, you can go online and you can fill in a form simply declaring that you don't have a television. And as I understand it, you'll never hear from them again. So, because a lot of people get intimidated by these letters that come through the door saying, to the legal resident, or the legal, whatever it happens to be, legal tenant, and they've got all this legalese and your name in capital letters and all this other bullshit trying to scare you into paying. So you don't need to do that. Last minute policy announcements relates to what you were just saying, or part of what you were just saying. What we've seen, you'll have noticed this in other campaigns, but there's been a flurry of it now, particularly in the last fortnight, and I expect to see more of it in the next week. It's actually been so profuse, it's been almost unbelievable. The party leaders going around now on a daily and sometimes hourly basis, promising it's not quite the brown envelope of cash, but promising some new concession to some new interest group or some new group of society, first-time buyers, single mothers, disabled black people, you name it, they're finding all these people and trying to buy them off. Now, of course, this won't work because you can't possibly, pay Peter and pay Paul, or rob them both and get away with it. But it's been very, very noticeable, and I've never seen it quite in such a state of policy panic as it is right now.
Well, they have these grids, don't they? Back in the good old days, you always regret the politicians who've passed when you see the new lot. In the good old days, there was just the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, and they both used to run a grid, and they'd have these policy announcements set up for various days, but they'd only be one a day. But we are seeing politicians panicking now. We saw the same thing with David Cameron just before the Scottish secession vote, where there was just a thought for a couple of days that it would actually go against the government. And so, the BBC ramped up the anti-secession message, because they basically work for the government and the state, not for particular political party, but for the British state. That's why they call it the British Broadcasting Corporation. And we are seeing this now. It's almost breaking through my curtain, which is starting to slightly annoy me. And people are coming up to me and saying, well, what about this and what about that? And I'm saying, I have no idea what you're talking about, which is very relaxing for me. But the odd thing does break through. And what no one ever asks is, how are you paying for this? Where are you getting the money from for this? There's only a couple of ways they can do it. I think there's 3 ways. They can either steal from, let's say, me and you, and take a cut on the way, of course, because they'll have to pay for themselves to pay for the people to come and take the money off us. Then they'll have to pay someone to decide who gets it. So there's always a government cost to taxation beyond merely being taxed. So they can steal it from someone else. They can borrow it, which is, of course, stealing from someone in the future, because there's only 2 ways of paying off borrowing. They can either steal off you in the future to pay off borrowing, or they can do the third thing. They can print money. And printing money via their friends at the Bank of England, how that works is the Bank of England creates money out of thin air and then goes and buys British government bonds, which it then keeps, and any profits which are paid to it by the British government in the form of interest on those bonds, and then becomes the profit of the Bank of England. At the end of the year, all the profits of the Bank of England go back to the Treasury. So it's a nice little circular loop there. So they can print the money, which basically dilutes the value of the money of all the rest of us. So there's only 3 ways they can gouge us. They can gouge us by stealing from us. They can gouge us by borrowing supposedly in our name, but it's not in my name. I never agreed to this, and then stealing off us in the future, or any time by just printing money, counterfeiting money, and diluting the value of all the money of all the rest of us. So no one's asking these questions. Where are you getting the money from? Second question nobody ever asks is, what gives you the right to do this? Whoever said that you can do these things? You can make these people a special privileged group. You can make that group of people a special privileged group. What gives you the right to do these things? Is it in democracy they can do anything they want? I mean, if 51% of people vote for people with red hair to be banned, then people with red hair get banned because 51% of people say it's okay, so it must be okay. The ideas of democracy are ridiculous. Where are they getting the money from for all these things, and what gives them the right to do all these things? And does it really make any difference to anything? Is it going to solve the underlying problems? And the underlying problems are ones of poverty, lack of security, still people who are unemployed, and we've got all sorts of other problems which aren't going to be solved by increasing some benefit by some amount of pence for some special group who happen to live in a constituency which they figured out if they get 50 more votes in their constituency, they'll win. I mean, democracy is a ridiculous process, and people in the ancient world knew it was ridiculous. I mean, Cleisthenes, the man who invented it, he invented it in Athens around 500 BC as a way of consolidating his power. His clan, the Alcmenid clan, had been thrown out of Athens a few years previously, and when they came back and threw out a tyrant at the time to cement their power, they had a lot of people supporting them. They created democracy to cement their power. It was such a good power grab that the Persians actually took the idea of democracy and introduced it in many Persian cities in the Persian Empire as a way of keeping the various populations of those cities down. It's always been used as a way of gaining power and keeping down and suppressing revolt amongst other people. And then we had Roman democracy, which was hilarious. Tiny groups of people, massively corrupt, people being bought off all the time. And we've come into the modern age, of course. We haven't learned the lessons of democracy, where it failed in the ancient world. People go on about Athens, of course, where this democracy is so wonderful. Yet what did democracy create in Athens? Well, we created democracy around 500 BC. Within 50 years, the same Alcmenid clan who invented it had given us the Delian League, which was a hated empire. It became a horrible empire which tried to soak up the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean, and eventually it was so hated by everybody, this democratic empire, that it was smashed by the Spartans, and everybody loved the Spartans for smashing Athens back and destroying the Delian League, because it was such a horrible monster created by democracy. So democracy has always created chaos. Democracy has always created poverty. And it's always headed us towards more state control and more socialism. And that's why I'm not bothering following this election. It makes absolutely no difference to me which way it goes. Afterwards, the BBC will still exist. The NHS will still exist. There'll still be massive state education. There might be a few tinkerings of rules here and a few tinkerings of rules there. Taxes might creep up by 0.25% or creep down by 0.25%, and some benefits might go up by a few pence, and some of the benefits will come down by a few pence. But actually, what's changed since David Cameron's been Prime Minister? Absolutely nothing. What will change after the next election? Essentially, absolutely nothing. It's a complete waste of time. And people who say to me things like, if you don't vote, you don't have the right to say anything about it. If people don't vote in a mafia crime commission election to vote who's going to be the mafia family in charge of New York this year, then that doesn't make it a good thing. And if anybody really wants to have a go at me for not voting, then I do recommend they go to YouTube and search for George Carlin Doesn't Vote, which will explain my position, which is basically, if you vote in an election, I'm going to blame you afterwards when things go wrong, and things are going to go wrong. You, by voting, have enabled those things to continue to keep going wrong. So it's not my fault. It's your fault if you vote and things go wrong, because they will. And if I stay away from the ballot box, then it's not my fault. I want nothing to do with this gang of crooks, this organised criminals called the British state. I want nothing to do with them. I do not want to participate in their spin-doctoring, propagandizing messages that my vote makes any difference whatsoever.
Yes, the whole thing really is akin to fiddling while Rome burns or rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. But with regards to George Carlin's famous stand-up clip, that's one thing that has crept into discussion in the last couple of days in particular with regards to political apathy, is that very point that if you don't vote, you've got no right to complain about it. But as you say, what about those of us who were born into this system and sort of said, well, where did I sign up for this? Why do I have to choose between 2, 3, now 10 flavours of bullshit? You know, what if I want something else? Is that what my life's supposed to be? Just to buy into this? You know, can we not strive for anything different? Are we going to go from cradle to grave and that's it? You know, so it's a positive imagination, really. But one interesting thing, the flip side to my point about the last minute policy announcements, you know, trying to buy people off, is even on the BBC, I've been listening to commentators saying, look, you know, they've been crunching the numbers at the polls, and they've been saying, well, do you know what? It's almost as if this campaign was pointless because it hasn't affected the polls. And that's interesting in itself, because it's been very frantic, very partisan, very much about throwing around favours, but the numbers haven't changed.
Well, I think the politicians get worried about this. It's strange, isn't it? Because in a local authority in the UK, if 4% of people vote, and one party wins 2.5% of the people who could have voted, which again, remember, is many children and various other people don't vote. So that could be 1.25% of people have voted. They still act as if they're absolute masters of the universe. But I think the politicians at Westminster are slightly different. If, say, only 50% of people who could vote did vote, I think they'd start to get very nervous. And I think those numbers are going to go down and down and down over time as people realise that voting is a total and absolute waste of time, and all you're doing is deciding who gets to sit in the limousines for the next 4 years. Voting numbers will continue to go down, and what they will do is they'll bring in all sorts of gimmicks to try to push those things up again. There'll be frenzied propaganda campaigns vilifying those of us who don't vote. They'll even bring in fines, I should imagine, like in Australia, if you don't vote. So again, like the Soviet Union, you will be compelled to take part in this charade called democracy. They will make it so you can vote by post very easily. They already have done that. You'll be able to click on a button on YouTube to vote. You'll be able to just look in a certain way at a certain time of day in a certain direction, and your vote will be taken into account. So I think politicians are getting very, very nervous about this. And of course, one of the main vehicles they used to use for this was the BBC, and they allowed ITV, but it was kind of BBC light, really. So there were two stations in the UK, and they could have party political broadcasts, and the companies had to show them. And because there was nothing else to do in the 1970s except watch Star Trek in black and white, the really good Star Trek with Captain Kirk in it and Mr. Spock, God rest his soul, we watch these party political broadcasts, but we don't anymore, do we? We watch YouTube. We listen to Greg Moffat podcasts. We build Ruby on Rails websites. We've got a million better. We watch Game of Thrones, and we catch up on our Skybox with old series of Games of Thrones. And we can't believe how Sean Bean was killed off in the first series. But there we go. Maybe he wanted to be written out of it so he could go and do other things. But people aren't watching the politicians. They're not watching the BBC. They're not watching Newsnight. They're not, they're doing many, many other things. So they're not connecting with us. And that's starting to worry them, that they don't have this day-to-day control of our minds. And that's why we're getting this frenzied vilification of us, the people who support them and pay for them and everything else, and particularly of people like me who not only won't vote but think it's absolutely hysterical that anyone thinks it makes any difference. So I think this frenzy will continue just in a bid. I think these policies every 2 hours not maybe even so much to get more votes in certain small constituencies. Maybe it's just noise, just like birds singing in the morning just to attract more mates. It's just a bird song. It's just, here I am, here I am, here I am, here I am. And if they keep saying it long enough, hopefully we'll notice them. But for the next few weeks, I don't even know when the election is. It could be tomorrow. I have no idea. It could be this week. It could be 2 weeks. It could be 3 weeks. So it's probably May, because they always try to have elections at the nicest time of year where things are getting better, because they think that makes us psychologically feel better. They try to avoid having them in, say, November and other dark, wet months. So they try to always have them in the most optimistic time of year, which is generally the beginning of May, just before the start of summer. So that's probably them, but I have absolutely no idea. I don't care. I'm not watching it. I'm not interested. They can jump around as much as they like in Whitehall, but I shall be happy when the UK starts breaking up, starts seceding, and all of these civil servants in London start being sacked and start running out of money, and they start printing worthless pounds that they can't buy anything with, and we start using other forms of money which they can't control and can't steal from us. I look forward to these days. I mean, I'm probably just a little bit too old to see much of this happening, but I think the process is relentless. I think as socialism grows, it sows the seeds of its own destruction. It collapses from within due to chaos. We see that accelerate when we have more socialism, as in the Soviet Union. We see it really, really accelerate in times of extreme socialism, such as the National Socialist government of Germany in the 1930s. But even in our slow democratic socialism, it will eventually fall apart. And as far as I'm concerned, the sooner the better.
Well, just a closing thought from me, Andy. I would say, again, to addressing people listening to this who think we've kind of deviated, which we definitely have. It's not a matter, it's not a matter of opinion. But, if some of these ideas are new, I would just encourage people to consider some of the concepts and the ideas and the historical tales that we've been discussing here in the light of the UK election, the current one, the past one. And if you're in the States or Australia, wherever you are, if you're living in a democracy, or even if you're not, just to consider some of these ideas in the light of your local political process, because a lot of this does ring true and it does have relevance.
Yeah, I think I've just found this. I just looked on Google. Maybe people don't like Google and want to use XQuick instead, then they can do that. And the thing you should look for, it's called Anarcho-Capitalism, an annotated bibliography. It's by Hans Hamann Hopper, who I have the great privilege of knowing. And the first thing is Ethics of Liberty by Murray Rothbard. Then For a New Liberty, Murray Rothbard, he is the king. Power of Market, again, Murray Rothbard. Egalitarianism as a Revolt Against Nature, Conceived in Liberty, which is that 4-volume book on the history of the United States seen through an economic perspective. And my favourite Murray Rothbard collection, that's the 2 books an Austrian perspective on the history of economic thought, which is just amazing. Getting away from Austria, obviously to read Democracy, the God That Failed by Hans Hermann Hoppe himself. And if you want to read other traditions which aren't in the Austrian tradition, Structure of Liberty, The Enterprise of Law by Bruce Benson, The Machinery of Freedom by David Friedman, and there's various others there. But the main thing to search for is on the LouRockwell.com site, Anarcho-Capitalism, an annotated bibliography by Hans Hermann Hoppe.
Right, Andy, well, the last time I looked, or the last time you were on, you didn't actually have a personal website, but I know you mentioned doing interviews, podcasts for Gold Money and Casey Research. I mean, should people be directed to those websites? If they do want to hear more of your dulcet tones, just tell people what they should do.
Oh, well, I'm not really doing very much at the moment. I'm currently working on building this new website, which will be released in the next few months. But if I told you any more, I'd have to kill you. So I can't really tell you much more about that. I suppose you could. There's lots of me on YouTube. So if you just go to YouTube and search for Andy Duncan, there's lots of podcasts and lots of, not videos, but kind of audio podcasts put up on YouTube, so you can listen to that. But the best thing I want you to do is to go to Amazon.com and search for Sword of Marathon by Jack England and download a copy of that. And interwoven between a story of many wenches and many sword fights is the history of the beginnings of democracy in ancient Athens, along with the Battle of Marathon between the Athenians and the Persians, which hasn't really been written about very much, so I thought I'd write about it. I actually really enjoy the book and enjoyed writing it, and I'm going to try to do a sequel on Thermopylae and the Battle of Salamis as well, and that'll be in the next couple of years, hopefully. But I've got to get this website done. That's the main thing, which is going to be a financially based fintech website. So again, if I told you any more about that, I'd have to do terrible things to you, so I can't really tell you much more. But hopefully at some point, once it's gone live, you'll interview me again about some spurious topic, and I'll be able to tell you all about it.
Certainly will, and I don't want to die yet. But anyway, Andy, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
My pleasure, and hope you have a good week and your party wins in the upcoming election.
Oh dear. Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programmes offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Based on current audience numbers, if everyone who tuned in donated just 5 pence per show, that's about 8 cents US, this could become a full-time, fully funded operation, offering more and more often. During October 2014, over 50,000 of you streamed or downloaded at least one show. Total donations were £7 UK, which currently converts to about $11 US. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.